let's look at some of the fundamental things about reporting to senior management and the board, how to do it, why it's important, and things like the frequency or the way that you can actually communicate to your senior management and your board. This is the second step in our operational management of an internal audit function, informing management on risk and internal audit control effectiveness. So let's look at this. We have some standards. These are the new standards from the Institute of Internal Auditors. And standard 8.1 is on board interaction. A few of the obligations set out to the chief audit executive is that there has to be periodic reporting to senior management and the board. I actually have witnessed internal audit function that were very timid at actually communicating key information to senior management and sometimes even to the board of directors itself. And yet this is absolutely an obligation. You have to make sure that you have a communication relationship with both of these different parties. Now, I say board of directors, but within this, I'm including the audit committee, which is a subcommittee of the board of directors. So what do we communicate? So first of all, we should communicate about the purpose, authority, responsibility, code of ethics, and standards that the internal audit function has adopted. All of these should be part of the internal audit charter. And of course, the internal audit charter is a very important document that should be approved by our board of directors or audit committee, but it should absolutely be communicated to the different members of management as well, so that they can properly understand the scope, responsibilities, rights, and obligations of the internal audit function itself. Our code of ethics to show that internal auditors are following these very important codes and different indicators about performance or about our conformance with standards. We're, of course, going to communicate about risks. Now, this might be fuzzy to some people, but communicating about risk is simply about telling people about the internal audit findings that we have. Because what is a finding? It is a residual risk that we have found in the operations of the organization. So we are going to report on the risks after the controls that the company or organization has put in place. And anything that we find is not properly dealt with by the company in its controls are going to be reported to our board of directors. Sometimes we just think that the controls are too weak. They're not effective. And we're going to say that there is a problem in the controls for the particular risk that we have. And again, we're going to be talking to the board of directors about things like operations are not very efficient or not very effective. The reporting isn't done on time. We believe there's a major risk in these operations. We could lose a lot of money if we don't do this, or we could face certain threats if we don't do that. And those are the kind of things that we're going to be telling our members of the board of directors and our audit committee and senior management about the effectiveness of controls themselves. So that basically means we don't think the controls are either well designed or properly performed for the kind of risks that the organization is facing, or about the risk responses, saying that the organization is facing a risk. We don't think that the method that the organization has used to manage these risks, response to these risks, is appropriate. Let's look at the communications to management and the board of directors. Now, our chief audit executive is going to communicate about significant risk exposures. The word significant means that it's important enough. I'm going to put it in my own little words. I'm going to say it should be something that our members of the board of directors actually cares about. It's not something insignificant. It's important enough for them to care. Now, you could also use the word material, which means it's big enough in the overall operations of the organization. The chief audit executive is going to report on the effectiveness of the internal controls and the management of risk. So we should look at, on one side, the risk management function. If there is a function in place for managing risk, or rather for coordinating the management of risk across the organization. And even if you don't have that risk management function, well, you should communicate about how all of the different functions manage risks at a first level of defense, or if they are overseeing risk, they're coordinating the management of different risks, or even assessing risks at a higher level. All of those different things, we should be telling our senior management, our board, our management about the management of risks and the different effectiveness of internal controls. The chief audit executive should also communicate about the internal audit plan. That can be the strategic or maybe, let's say, 3-year internal audit plan, as well as the annual or periodic internal audit plan. In other words, what internal audit will be looking at in the next few years or even within the next few months. Each of these should have board of directors or audit committee approval. Finally, the chief audit executive should look at different key performance indicators on internal audit and report about these. Now, this is where I'm going to say this is often incorrectly done. But what does this mean? We're going to, at the very least, tell people about the progress on our different engagements, how we're doing compared to our plan. We might be saying to management about how much staff we've managed to recruit, and also to our audit committee and board of directors, what maybe a little bit about the skills that we have, about, let's say, the number of high risk, medium, low risk findings that we have, how many of these have actually been resolved within, let's say, the last 12 months. So we're going to really talk about these different key performance indicators to our different actors and stakeholders that care about these. And then finally, we're going to talk about significant risk exposures and control issues, such as conditions that could adversely affect the ability of the organization to achieve its objectives. So what are these conditions? That's what we really call a risk. And sometimes the risk is going to be sufficiently high because we have weak or ineffective controls. So improperly designed controls, ineffective controls are conditions that could make it more difficult for the organization to achieve its objectives. Objectives, setting out the reporting on time, being compliant with laws, making enough sales, etc., are all things that the organization wants. But maybe sometimes you're going to have weak controls over those, such as improper approvals means that you're sending out things that have plenty of errors. And that's kind of condition, which means that your objective of being compliant with laws and regulations, for instance, will not be correctly performed. Okay. And then we're going to look at things like whether controls reduce risks to an acceptable level. Again, think about the particular vocabulary that I'm implying through this. What does it mean that controls have been reduced to an acceptable level? I mean that the residual risk, so the risk after controls have done their little magic, that means to say responded to the risk, reduced them, mitigated the risk. The risk appetite is how much risk our board of directors actually wants within the organization. And so we want to make sure that our risks have been decreased by our controls and risk responses to something that our board of directors says is okay at the end.